Sometimes a name comes along that simply doesn't fit the usual trade rumor mill because he's too talented, too young, too much of a genuine former #1 pick to actually be realistically in play. And yet, tonight on the show, I have to tell you about exactly that kind of situation, because we are talking about a two-time All-Star, a former #1 overall pick, still only 25 years old, and a team that makes real sense as a suitor is the Golden State Warriors. So stay with me, Warriors fans, because the idea of pairing this kind of explosive downhill force with Stephen Curry's shooting gravity is exactly the kind of move that could give this dynasty one more real championship chance. Here's exactly what's being reported, cutting right through the noise. According to sources, New Orleans' new head of basketball operations, Joe Dumars, has publicly said the team has no plans to trade Zion Williamson, but people close to the situation describe a front office that isn't completely married to him either, and would be willing to listen if the right blockbuster package landed on the table. With real fit questions already surfacing between Zion and the team's young center, and a new front office looking to put its own stamp on the roster, this situation is genuinely more fluid than it appears on the surface. Zion Williamson, in a Warriors uniform, playing next to Stephen Curry. Read that line again, slowly, because if you understand just how rare this level of physical dominance is, and you understand exactly what this Warriors roster has lacked at forward for years, you understand why this could be one of the most electrifying moves of the entire offseason, and I am here to walk you through, step by step, exactly why a player this talented might genuinely be in play, because it's a fascinating situation developing in real time. Now, I already know exactly what some of you are going to bring up, the health history, the assets, and whether the Warriors could even put together a real offer, and we are going to get to every single bit of it, I promise, because I always give you the honest version, but stay with me through this one, because pairing a physically overwhelming, still young, former #1 pick with Stephen Curry is exactly the kind of move that could extend this dynasty. Let me start with why Zion Williamson is even in this conversation, because it's a fascinating situation. The Zion Williamson era in New Orleans has simply not gone as the franchise hoped. Since he was drafted, the Pelicans have had losing records in 5 of his 7 seasons, making the playoffs just twice, and losing in the first round both times. New Orleans just hired Joe Dumars as their new head of basketball operations, and Dumars has already fired the head coach, hired a new one in Jamal Mosley, and made it clear he intends to put his own stamp on this roster. While Joe Dumars has publicly said the team has absolutely no plans to move Zion Williamson right now, sources close to the situation have described a front office that is genuinely not married to him either, willing to listen if the right package, especially one built around a star of real, genuine significance, comes together. There are also real, legitimate questions about roster fit, since lineups pairing Zion with the team's young center have actually been outscored quite significantly this past season, forcing the coaching staff to limit their shared minutes together down the stretch. That right there is the crack in the door, and it is genuinely open, and let me underline just how real this new era of player movement is, because it's the whole foundation here. Think about what we have already witnessed in this offseason alone. A 2-time MVP was traded in one of the biggest blockbusters in recent NBA history. A star all-pro wide receiver over in the NFL was dealt to a new home. Across the league, the franchise cornerstones everyone assumed could never move have changed teams one after another. The old certainties are simply dead. And in Zion Williamson's specific case, you have a former #1 pick on a new front office's radar, real fit questions with the roster already forming around him, and reporting suggesting his name would genuinely be in play if the right blockbuster presented itself. The door is open, the situation is genuinely fluid, and the only question is which contender is bold enough to make the call. So now let me tell you exactly who Zion Williamson is, in case anyone needs the reminder, because this is the part that should get you right up and out of your seat. Zion Williamson is one of the most singularly explosive, physically overwhelming forwards the sport has ever produced. He was the #1 overall pick, a National Player of the Year out of Duke, and a player many scouts called a can't-miss generational talent the moment he stepped on an NBA floor. He's a genuine 2-time All-Star, a 285-pound force of nature who plays above the rim with a combination of speed and power that genuinely has no real comparison anywhere else in the entire league. He's averaged well over 23 points a game across his entire career, shooting at a genuinely elite efficiency, the kind of downhill scorer who simply cannot be stopped one-on-one once he gets a full head of steam going. And this past season, he finally delivered the exact kind of health and availability that silenced a lot of his doubters around the league, playing in 62 games, the second most of his entire career, while averaging 21 points, 5.7 rebounds, and 3.2 assists on an efficient 60% shooting from the field. Acquiring a player like this isn't just adding a piece. It's adding a former #1 pick with genuine top-tier superstar upside, still only 25 years old. And let me put his resume in proper context, because it tells you why this is such a fascinating story. A former #1 overall pick, a two-time All-Star, a player whose per-minute impact, when healthy, ranks among the most dominant interior forces in the entire league. He is still just 25 years old, which means whichever team lands him isn't just getting a talented player, they're getting a player who should be entering the absolute prime years of his career. Players with this specific blend of youth, physical dominance, and all-star pedigree essentially never become realistic trade targets unless something has genuinely shifted inside the organization that drafted them. That's exactly why his situation in New Orleans has become one of the most closely watched stories of the entire summer. So now let's talk about why this fits the Warriors so perfectly, because it addresses the single biggest hole this roster has had for the entire back half of the Curry era. But first, let me make sure you really appreciate how rare a player like this actually is, because it's the whole point of the story. In today's NBA, the hardest thing in the world to find is a player who combines this level of physical dominance with this level of skill. A player defenses simply cannot contain one-on-one, no matter how they scheme against him. Most players need either elite size or elite speed, not both at this extreme. Zion Williamson has both, at a level that has drawn comparisons to the most physically unique players the sport has ever produced. Think about how few 25-year-old former #1 picks with multiple all-star selections and this level of downhill force are even theoretically available on the trade market at any given time. You can count them on one hand across the entire league, so the mere fact that his situation has grown genuinely uncertain is the entire reason this story matters so much. Here's the situation in Golden State. We are in the absolute final act of one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history, and the Warriors are coming off a season where they were closer to a play-in team than a real contender. This roster has never had a true, downhill, physically overwhelming forward to pair with Curry's shooting gravity, the exact kind of player who can finish above the rim off Curry's constant off-ball movement while giving the offense a second, completely different way to score. Just imagine Curry spacing the floor from 30 feet while Zion Williamson bulldozes his way to the rim, drawing double teams that open up even more space for Curry and the rest of the roster. Just imagine a Warriors offense with two genuinely different, equally impossible problems for a defense to solve at the same time. That's not just an improvement, that's the kind of pairing that could extend Curry's championship window in a way almost nothing else on the trade market could. And let me put this in the context of what the Warriors are actually chasing, because it raises the stakes enormously. This is a franchise that measures itself in championships, and Curry's prime window is closing by the day. A young, physically dominant former #1 pick becoming even loosely available does not come around often. Passing on a chance to explore this would be exactly the kind of missed opportunity a front office with the Warriors championship standards cannot afford to let slip by without at least picking up the phone. So now let's talk about how this would actually work in practice, because the mechanics matter here. A trade for Zion Williamson would almost certainly have to include Jimmy Butler's expiring contract as the centerpiece of the entire outgoing package, along with real draft capital on top, since New Orleans has signaled a real, significant return could get them to genuinely listen. It would be a genuinely complicated, multi-piece trade to construct, no question about it whatsoever. But the Warriors have shown time and again that they will get aggressive and creative when they believe their championship window is still open. And let me put the on-court fit into even sharper terms, because in a playoff series, it's everything. Stephen Curry is going to get his offense, no matter what a defense throws at him, but playoff basketball comes down to what happens when the shots stop falling and you need a different way to generate offense. A player who can simply put the ball on the floor and get to the rim through pure physical force, without needing a perfect play design, gives an offense a completely separate gear to shift into when the game slows down. Zion Williamson at his best is exactly that kind of downhill closer, the ideal complement to a shooter whose value is almost entirely about gravity and spacing rather than physical interior scoring. And let me put this in the context of what's actually at stake here because it raises the urgency. This is a franchise that has already won 4 championships with this core, but the calendar doesn't lie. And every year that passes without a real shot at one more title is a year the front office cannot get back. Adding a young, physically dominant talent, even with real questions attached, is exactly the kind of bold swing a front office makes when it understands the clock is running out. But I told you I'd be honest, so let's take the doubts head on because on this one, they are very real. The first and biggest objection is health. Zion Williamson has genuinely battled hamstring and back injuries throughout his entire career, and betting a real significant trade package on his long-term availability is a genuine, honest risk to take. That's the single most legitimate concern of all, and I won't pretend otherwise. The counter is that on a deep, well-coached roster, his workload could potentially be managed more carefully than it ever was in New Orleans. The second objection is the cost, since moving Butler and real draft capital for a player still developing as a floor spacer is a steep price. Fair, but the Warriors have consistently shown they value proven, high-ceiling talent over hoarding draft assets, and a 25-year-old former #1 pick fits that exact profile. The third objection is the fit and the timeline, since building real chemistry between 2 very different offensive stars takes time the Warriors may not have. Fair, but a talent this physically dominant makes any roster around him instantly more dangerous, even before the fit is fully ironed out. So let me tell you where my head is at, and then I've got one final thought that I think is the real key to all of this. If the Warriors pull this off, they finally give Stephen Curry a true downhill, physically dominant partner, and they do it while adding a player young enough to be part of the franchise's future as well. Just picture it for a second. Curry spacing the entire floor from deep range, Zion Williamson bulldozing his way to the rim and drawing double teams on nearly every possession. A Warriors offense suddenly impossible for any defense to load up against in a single direction. Whether it works comes down to health and the cost, and that's the real debate. But the ceiling of this move is a genuine championship push, and for a franchise that owes Curry everything, that's a swing worth taking. And here's the thought I want to leave you with, the part almost nobody is connecting. A young, physically dominant former #1 pick becoming even loosely available is one of the rarest opportunities in basketball. New Orleans hasn't said they're moving him, that's the honest reality, but a new front office genuinely open to listening, combined with real questions about roster fit, is exactly the kind of situation that eventually produces a trade, and the Warriors, with a closing championship window, are exactly the kind of team that should be exploring it. So let me boil it all the way down for you, because I want this crystal clear. A dynasty in its absolute final act, still led by the greatest shooter the game has ever seen, in need of a completely different kind of offensive weapon. A former #1 overall pick and 2-time All-Star, still only 25, with a new front office in New Orleans that isn't fully married to him. The honest obstacles are the health history, the cost of moving Butler, and the fit questions. But how many times have the Warriors wished a true physical force would fall into their lap? This might genuinely be that chance, so let me boil it all the way down for you, because I want this crystal clear one more time. A dynasty in its absolute final act, still led by the greatest shooter the game has ever seen, in genuine need of a completely different kind of offensive weapon to extend the window even further. A former #1 overall pick and 2-time All-Star, still only 25 years old, with a new front office in New Orleans that has said publicly there are no plans to trade him, but genuinely isn't married to him either. The honest obstacles are the health history, the real cost of moving Jimmy Butler, and the fit questions between 2 very different offensive stars. But how many times over the years have the Warriors wished a true physically dominant force would simply fall into their lap? This might genuinely be that rare chance. I'm not telling you it's signed. I have no reporting that says the ink is dry, and I am never going to make something up for you, because the only reason you keep coming back to me is that I shoot you straight, even when the honest version is that Dumars has publicly said New Orleans has no plans to trade him. That's true, and this is more about a fluid situation worth watching than a deal already in motion. But I am telling you, the talent is genuine. The fit next to Curry is fascinating, and a former #1 pick still in his mid-20s is one of the rarest assets there is.